So, anyway, as I was saying, or miming at least, we've had to bump up the release date of this week's episode by one day. And that's so we can coincide with the first, now international, Silent Movie Day. Though I keep wanting to call it Silent Film Day. But regardless, September 29th. So, obviously, this being the first year, there really isn't much of a history lesson to give, but my understanding is that this comes to us from the head of the Pittsburgh Silent Film Society, an organization I had never heard of up until very, very recently. But I guess his rationale was that, well, there's already a day for pretty much everything else. International Talk Like a Pirate Day, anyone? So, of course, why not a day dedicated to celebrating silent film? So, with that, admittedly, that's not really a big staple of the archive. I think we've only gone into any real depth on it maybe twice and touched on it, I think, 4 or 5 times in almost a decade now. But in spite of that, I feel like I'm probably the most sympathetic to silent film preservation, and I think I can really safely say that I am the most attuned to the art form out of anyone else in the whole YouTube reviewer sphere. So, with that, admittedly, today's episode's going to be a little bit of a mess. So I'm going to try and hit as many targets as I can in what I think is going to be a 35 to 40 minute episode. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to kick things off with my own story with silent film, what caught my attention, how I got into it, and what kind of impact it's had on me. And then after that, it's going to become more of a beginner's guide to silent film. So we'll start casually chatting about some movies, good entry points, the odd book, and I'll try and give you some tips and tricks on, say, how to pick out a good DVD or Blu-ray. But yeah, this is going to be one of our looser episodes. And that's saying quite a bit. But anyway, let's kick things off with that personal story time. So let's turn the clock back to 1990, in which a much younger, cuter version of old Benny Boy gets the ever-loving hell scared out of him by some dude in a bowler hat and an obviously fake, undersized mustache.
You remember Goldilocks, the kid who used to take her meals at the Three Bears place? Nowadays, she heads for Shakey's with 21 kinds of great pizza.
At the dawn of the 90s, my family was living in West suburban Chicago. Is there any other kind? And one place we periodically went to was some pizza place, maybe it was a Shakey's, that showed public domain silent movies on the wall. This is where I first saw Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp character, whose grotesque form, coupled with some tinkly and unrelated ragtime music, scared the ever-loving hell out of me. Bear in mind, I was also that kid that dove behind the couch whenever the emergency broadcast system test would come on. Anyway, I think that, and the EBS, started my lifelong habit of pursuing those things that scared me and ultimately making peace with, if not outright embracing, those things. Granted, it took a long time. As for Chaplin, probably about as late as 1996, whenever I saw The Little Tramp, I'd avert my eyes, or if it was on TV, change the channel. In 1998, my curiosity of these weird, distant, foreign to me oddities got the best of me, and I finally attempted to watch some silence, just avoiding Chaplin at first. I don't know if it was the first silent I ever saw a decent amount of, but I seem to remember seeing part of the first film attempt at The Cat and the Canary from 1927 on AMC. and being simultaneously transfixed and horrified. Not long thereafter, AMC reran it at 4 or 5 a.m. on some obscure weekday morning. Having seen the listing for it in the newspaper's weekly TV guide, kind of a Bible to me back then, I popped in a tape and set the timer. I noticed that there was another silent being shown first, Buster Keaton's Sherlock Jr. I recognized the Keaton name from somewhere and opted to record both movies. Despite being an especially surreal film, and in all fairness, most of it is a dream sequence, I found Keaton to be a friendly and relatable presence. That and I was blown away by the stunts. Oh yeah, and the whole movie only clocks in at 45 minutes, making it especially easy to take. While I did watch and eventually embrace Cat and the Canary, Sherlock Jr. proved to be my gateway drug into the silence.
Come on, we're gonna have a ball. Just leave your cares and woes and let your troubles fall.
In 1999, my family switched from cable to satellite TV. With it came Turner Classic Movies. Upon finding out about their still ongoing Silent Sunday Night feature, I began semi-regularly recording the late night feature, and over the next few years was introduced to the works of D.W. Griffith and F.W. Murnau and all those directors with the good initial names that end in W, as well as the performances of Lon Chaney, Lillian Gish, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Rudolph Valentino, Theda Bara, Harold Lloyd, and several others. Oh yeah, and I finally embraced Chaplin. Jumping back to 1998, I started periodically picking up public domain silence on VHS out of the bargain bin. Alas, save for a couple of cheap Chaplin box sets, I ultimately gave away or sold those tapes. Between the cheapy tapes and my constant use of EP mode on the VCR, I grew accustomed to an often muddy, barely discernible, often surreal soup of hazy, lost images. Coupled with my habit of listening to Pink Floyd, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Derek and the Dominos while watching these, and well, let's just say I didn't need any artificial stimulation. Aside from those tapes, the silents were what prodded me into getting my first film projector, an ancient Keystone Standard 8 silent projector from no later than 1962. Alas, this projector gave its life to the archive in 2017. Anyway, over time, I've built up silence on 8 and Super 8mm, Betamax, CED, Laserdisc, VCD, DVD, and Blu-ray. Hell, the whole reason I got a Laserdisc player in the first place was because a player and the 3 volumes of the Art of Buster Keaton set was cheaper than what the DVD set sold for in 2003.
In those days, the lighting was pretty crude. It was more illumination rather than lighting.
When we made pictures, we ate, we slept.
Ever since I was a child, my parents objected, of course, to my having a career.
I guess what really cemented my interest in the silence and raised my respect levels thereof was TCM's habit in the early 2000s of running film documentaries late every Friday afternoon, oftentimes documentaries about the silence. The one that really stands out was Kevin Brownlow's 1980 13-part opus, Hollywood, a celebration of the American silent film, which TCM re-ran over the span of several weeks in probably 2001. While parts of Hollywood are available via Amazon Prime streaming as of September 2021, I question the legality of it. It's obviously sourced from VHS and is super compressed. As such, as it stands, you will have to pry my Laserdisc copy of this sucker from my cold, dead hands. Anybody know how to get in touch with Mr. Brownlow? As for long-lasting impact, well, for one, if you're insane enough to have followed my Ben's Music Career sub-series, you know that the silence often informed my stabs at music, lasting my entire run from 2001 to 2011. This here Oddity Archive is probably the only show on YouTube insane enough to drop the odd reference to Paul Lenny films like it's perfectly normal. And even if my consumption of the silence in recent years has been confined to the odd Blu-ray or Fleabane Laserdisc, it's never completely gone out of my life. Nor do I expect it to, nor do I want it to. Now, when's that Mabel Normand box coming out? Well, I already discussed how Buster Keaton was my gateway drug into the silence, so what do I consider to be good entry points into silent film? Well, with regards to comedy, in spite of my undying love of Keaton, I might actually be quicker to suggest the works of Harold Lloyd. And I say that because his persona as the slightly nerdy everyman, I think, is a little more relatable, and the character that he played, with odd exceptions. I mean, the whole glasses thing was more a springboard than anything else, but usually he played an everyman, somebody who just worked at the department store, worked at an ice cream parlor, was a hand on the family farm, that sort of thing. So anyway, this would be Lloyd's most famous film, Safety Last, and you may very well have seen that picture of him hanging from the clock somewhere before, if not several places. Now, Safety Last is not my favorite of Lloyd's movies, although it's not too far off. It's somewhere more or less in the upper tier. But this, I think, is a good starting point for silence, especially silent comedy, in that it kind of hits both targets, both the character and the more gag-driven, thrill-driven ones. So the first half of it revolves around Lloyd working at a department store and just being absolutely poor, and he's moved to the big city to make it. He's stuck working at a department store. His girlfriend from whatever small town he came from decides to come visit him, and he, through a series of coincidences, comes up with a publicity stunt to make some noise for the department store and make himself, I think it's $1,000, if memory serves, $1,000 in 1923 dollars. Adjust that for inflation. So anyway, the first half of it is, like I said, more of a character piece, and then it becomes more of a thrill picture. Most of it is Lloyd climbing the side of a building. That's the publicity stunt for the department store. And basically everything that can go wrong, short of death, happens. So with regards to, this is the Criterion Blu-ray issue of it. If you're into documentaries, this is also a good one to start with, because this includes the documentary on Lloyd called The Third Genius, another Kevin Brownlow-ism. And it was in 3 parts. Here in the States, I think it aired on PBS. And over in England, I think it would have still been Thames Television in 1989. So that makes it kind of a double win to me. So you can get a good entry point into silence and also get a good documentary and a pretty informative one. So obviously, I guess I'm going to have to mention Chaplin, and I'm with regards to comedy. Yeah, for that first shot, I'd say probably stick with one of the big three, and then work your way out. So, admittedly, my Chaplin collection is still mostly confined to VHS, but this is about as prized as my Chaplin DVDs get. This rounds up the shorts he made for First National, which became Warner Brothers years later. And the restorations on here are really good. Unfortunately, this is out of print and fairly valuable. But yeah, it's one of the few bits of Chaplin that I've ever really upgraded. I still haven't bought any Chaplin Blu-rays yet. I have one of the Warner Brothers DVDs from the mid-2000s, and it's got a horrible PAL to NTSC transfer going on. It's just, somebody walks across the shot and it leaves kind of a ghost behind. It's just kind of a mess. So I like Chaplin well enough. I have a lot of his stuff, again, mostly on VHS, and the big ones too. Gold Rush, City Lights, Modern Times, and so on. Great Dictator. But yeah, I've just never gotten around to it. But yeah, I suppose I should at least mention him. The conventional wisdom with regards to silent dramas is that you start with the works of D.W. Griffith. And I'm a little dubious about that wisdom. So to me, D.W. Griffith's work is more noteworthy if you're a student of film or you're a student of history. But if you're looking for something entertaining, they're hit and miss. So I'll get back to this one. But since we're talking D.W. Griffith, I suppose I should address the infamous one, The Birth of a Nation. And maybe just the act of showing this cover might not make YouTube too happy, so I guess I'll flip it over here. So anyway, my attitude about Birth of a Nation is that you really have to wear your historian hat when you watch this one. Now, I should say here that I think we've gotten to a point, especially in the last few years, where we have gotten way too fast and loose with language, and we use words to the point where they lose their meaning. Words that are supposed to be potent. But having said that, even I think this movie is kind of racist. So with that in mind, again, wear your historian hat. And also know that it's based on a novel written by an old Confederate who was kind of bitter after the war. And D.W. Griffith kind of just grew up around those stories. I don't know how seriously he took them, but I think in his mind, it was just part of life. It was just part of Americana, and also the springboard for a nice big epic movie. So of course we can't truly know what D.W. Griffith's intent was, although he did follow it up with a movie called Intolerance, which seems to willfully set out to undo a fair amount of what Birth of a Nation did. But yeah, as I said, wear the historian hat and pack your patience, because this one is, at least this particular issue, is a little over 3 hours. Now, I've got a handful of these late 90s, early 2000s Image Entertainment DVDs. These are the same ones sourced from Black Hawk Films that had already been on VHS and Laserdisc, and they didn't really do too much of them. I mean, they're restorations, but they're not what we would think of in this far into the 21st century of a real silent restoration. So anyway, getting back to the movie I initially had at the top of the stack, Orphans of the Storm. This is my favorite of Griffith's films. So what we got here is a story about a couple of twins who, one of whom is blind, who get lost and separated in the madness of the French Revolution. And of course they do eventually come back together. But it's a pretty well-paced movie, but at the same time it is not a shorty. It's 2.5 hours. But I think it's, just in terms of pacing and clarity, it's probably Griffith's best. So, there you go. Now, going very much into the more artsy end of things, we've got The Passion of Joan of Arc. And this is a pretty tough movie. For a lot of people, it would be the kind of movie you would only ever have to see once. So it's a French film, and as the title would imply, it is about Joan of Arc. It's mostly about her trial and subsequent execution. And so this is one that can completely shatter your illusions about silent films being crude and shallow, overly simple at times. This is a more difficult, more complex movie, and it's also shot almost entirely in close-ups, and very, very clear close-ups, to the point where you can see the pores on the actors' faces, perhaps a little too well. So this is one that I really enjoyed, but again, it's a toughie. Now, going to the opposite end of the drama spectrum, we're going to head into camp territory now. With this one, A Fool There Was, starring Theda Bara, from 1915. So we're talking the same year as Birth of a Nation here. And very little of her stuff survives, unfortunately. But she was typecast as a vamp, and not as a vampire in the Dracula sense, but someone who, for whatever strange reason, and this is the one that started it all, will just go and kind of do all but kill men. So the fun of this one is that she goes around and drains men of their money and their families and their will to live, preferably older married men. She does it for no reason whatsoever. It just happens. It's just pure evil. But it's a lot of fun to watch. Now, as I mentioned, very little of Theda Bara's stuff has survived, and this only survives by way of 16 millimeters. So this one's a little tougher to watch. And this is the full-fledged Kino issue. I'll talk about them a little more later. But, yeah. Hopefully that gives you a little cross-section. We'll start with a bit of an archive classic here. So with regards to silent horror, some of the scariest movies I've ever seen are silent horror films. And I guess it's the absence of sound and the, at times, kind of crude makeup and at times bad prints kind of unintentionally adding to the vibe. But to me, silent horror tends to have an edge to it that most of the talky stuff just lacks. Not to say that I don't like me a good slasher flick every now and then, but there's something really satisfying about these to me. So my chief recommendation, if you're completely new to silent horror, would be one of the true biggies of the genre, and that would be Nosferatu from 1922. And yes, it is the story of Dracula. It's just that if I have the story right, the book Dracula was still under copyright at the time, and Murnau, F.W. Murnau, just couldn't clear the rights to it from Bram Stoker's estate, and so they just changed names and plot details and hoped for the best. Well, they still ran into opposition from Bram Stoker's estate and were ordered to recall and destroy all prints of the film. But obviously some good bookkeeping was not happening because a few prints of it did survive. Now, having said that, those prints were copied every way to Sunday, and this film, I should say, has been on every public domain label under the sun. So this is one that you do kind of want to find a good restoration of. So this particular issue, I believe, is the first significant DVD issue. And this is really just ported over from the Kino VHS and the Image Entertainment Laserdiscs from the early 90s. And indeed, like my D.W. Griffiths, they are late 90s Image Entertainment Black Hawk Films sourced. So they are restorations, but not super neat ones either. But this is one of those movies that if your whole thing is aesthetic and you want it to be a little dirty, a little scratchy, a little messed up, even the best restorations of this are still kind of scratchy. So if that's your thing, don't worry about it. But there's a real nice vibe to this one. Now, we have to discuss probably the most famous silent horror film, period, and that would be Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney. And this is another public domain thing, and it's been on every label known to man, but it's also one that you want to find a good restoration of. And this is one of those movies with a really messed up history. So it is from 1925, and the 25 version is on here, but it's not much of a restoration. But most of the film historians like to base their restorations on the 1929 reissue. Now, regardless, this film had a sequence in 2-strip Technicolor initially, and most of those cheapy reissues of this do not have it, in color, that is. And it's a very well done one, and the color is effective, and I would argue necessary. So you do want to find a decent copy of this one. But again, the 1929 version is really more the standard bearer. It's just one of those dates that gets kind of mangled by people. And then there was another stab at it from 1930 where they overdubbed a soundtrack to it with dialogue. And the soundtrack is not complete at this point. And there have been little kind of stabs at recreating parts of it, but really it's just more cheesy than anything else. But yeah, this is a good one to go for. And even though this, I think, has been out for like a decade now, I believe this particular issue is still in print. And yeah, it's a Black Hawk Films, but Black Hawk's gotten a lot better over the years. And it was always pretty decent, but they've really upped their game. Now, speaking of Lon Chaney, a lot of his movies are not horror, but they just come off as horror. They almost always have a serious creep factor to them. In case that cover isn't enough to go by, that's from Laugh Clown Laugh. Now, as far as this set goes, I think this is the last of the TCM Archives sets that's managed to stay in print. And my personal favorite of the 3 films on here would be The Unknown, which is only about an hour long, but it's a pretty tough movie. And it's a true horror movie, even if it doesn't call itself that. But it's not horror in the way that you would think of. Most people think lots of blood and stuff, and no, but there's plenty of dismemberment if you're into that. So for this last one, I'm completely breaking the rules here. This is Hexen, Witchcraft Through the Ages. And this is a little bit of a horror movie, but this is kind of just I don't know what you want to call it. It's kind of a grab bag of a film. It's a little horror, it's a little black comedy, and it's partially a straight documentary. And having said that, this is not an occult film, so if that's a concern of yours, don't worry about it. But this is an early Criterion DVD of it, and this has been re-restored again since this came out, probably pushing 20 years ago. But as far as this issue goes, I do recommend the original 1922 cut above all. But there is a recut on here from 1968, which, if you're into Jean-Luc Ponty, the violin player, he did the soundtrack for it, and There's a narration from William S. Burroughs, the guy that wrote Naked Lunch. So kind of an interesting thing, but I can see where the hippie era would have latched onto this. This is one of those things that you just have to kind of watch to really understand. Talking about it doesn't really do it justice. Like an idiot, when I moved a few years ago, I managed to give away some stuff to the Goodwill that I shouldn't have. And some intentional, some not so. But one of the unintentional donations was an older copy of a book called The Parades Gone by Kevin Brownlow. There's that name again. And that book provides actually a very good general basic cross-section of silent film history. And that thing was actually written back in the mid to late 60s. But at the same time, there were still plenty of surviving silent era performers and crew members, and it drew upon those. And some of that book is kind of dated now, but it is, like I said, it's a good general overview. So if you want to talk starting points, that's a good one to go for. And believe it or not, that book is still in print 50 odd years later. You can still pop on Amazon and get a copy. Now, as for me, I was going to show it off here, but I didn't even realize until I started working on this episode that I had accidentally given it away. Now, I have since ordered another copy, but it did not show up in time for shooting all this. But having said that, I do have another one of Kevin Brownlow's books here, and I actually have a couple more, but those are on Kindle. But this one is what I am pretty sure spurred or at least coincided with the Hollywood documentary, the big 13-parter I mentioned earlier. But this is called Hollywood, the Pioneers. It's from 1979, and this one is out of print. But at the same time, it's actually still pretty accessible, and there's Buster Keaton again. But on just about any given day, you can find a copy of this one on Fleabay or wherever for well under $10. Now, whereas The Parades Gone By is kind of, again, a general overview, and it mostly deals with the performers and directors, Hollywood, the Pioneers, for one, it's got a ton of pictures, but this one has more of a historical bent to it, and also a little more of a technical bent to it. So this one is more about the context of the times. Now, I mentioned pictures. So, unbeknownst to me, when I first got this, because I didn't thumb through it too thoroughly when I first got it, I was just I have this habit of taking a book with me when I'm going to be in a waiting room or something like that, or if I go out to eat or something. So I had the book here with me, and I was at Grease Monkey getting the oil changed on my car, and there's a few nudie pics in this book. And sure enough, I had to be sitting next to the nice little old lady when I turned the page and was met with a naked woman. So, oh well, thanks for the warning. But moving on, changing gears here, at this point, just about every reasonable sized figure in the Silence has had at least one biography written about them. And of course, a few of them wrote autobiographies, but those are kind of hit and miss. Like, you all know I love Buster Keaton, but his autobiography, I'd be willing to bet, was almost entirely written by someone else, if only because the tone of the book clashes so badly with any interviews with Keaton. So you have to keep that in mind. And sometimes this was, a lot of people coming from vaudeville and stuff, they would spin yarns about their life, and oftentimes outright tall tales. So, if you're a big fan, I suppose you can read those, but just know that it's probably not going to be that accurate. And that brings me to my next point with regards to books, and that would be, if you have any interest in any particular figure, try and find a book maybe from the late 90s onward. And my main reasoning for that being that a lot of certainly 70s and 80s books tend to be a little more tabloid-ish, a bit more lurid, and not necessarily lurid in a sense of giving more context, but just to hopefully cynically sell more books. So at this point, a lot more materials on the individuals have surfaced, and the authors today are in simply a better position to report on the people. And in addition to that, this isn't the 80s anymore. There's self-publishing now. There's a lot more indie publishers. And so you're not at the mercy of a Simon and Schuster or something, and you have to worry about, can I get this onto the New York Times bestseller lists? The playing field's a bit more level now. So that's my main reasoning in sticking with the more recent books. Of course, there are always exceptions. Now, speaking of those more recent books, frustratingly, those books seem to just drift in and out of availability. And I'm just going to give you a random picture, and hopefully not one of the nudies. But anyway, those newer ones just drift in and out of availability. And so the price will fluctuate on those things like crazy on the aftermarket. But as such, my main suggestion, if you're just getting into the reading end of things, this is going to sound really lame and really basic, but check with your local library first. Well, in case you ever wondered where old Benny Boy picked up his preservationist/historian streak, now you know. But I also think I can blame silent film for my distaste of gatekeepers. So I'm going to go off on a little bit of a rant here to close things out today. So I've noticed over the last few years, on those rare occasions anymore where I do go through the silent film geek forums, and more commonly the silent film groups I belong to on Facebook, you've seen their stuff in my news feed, that in certain circles there's been kind of this nasty tendency that's developed towards chasing out the newbies and the casual fans. Now, when your cause is as esoteric and as preservation dependent as something like silent film, I don't think that's terribly wise. So, really, would you want to get cliquish about something like that? Are you so greedy about it that you're okay with it dying off with you whenever that day happens to come? So with that, tying into Silent Movie Day here, my interpretation of the press release they put out was, the idea is to open the tent so that people that might not necessarily be interested in silent film can at the very least take a look into it, maybe develop a little appreciation, and maybe even see the beauty that nutcases like me happen to see in it. But whether or not that's truly the mission, it doesn't matter. That's the one that I'm affixing to the day. So anyway, that is it for today's archive. Join me next time when, out of sheer commercial necessity, we return to our usual stomping grounds of the 70s, 80s, and 90s.